Hey guys, welcome to week 8 of Confirmation 2.0. My name is Pastor Matt.
And I'm Pastor Casey.
And we're pumped to dive in because we're actually going to dive into something that I'll be honest with you. At first, I thought it was kind of just a recap of like 1st and 2nd Kings, which is 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And in fact, when I first read it, I'll never forget this. I'm like, I've already read these stories. They're in here twice. So it's going to be kind of fun to talk about why we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because even though you see a lot of overlap between 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings, there's actually a far different reason 1st and 2nd Chronicles is being written. And it's trying to bring you to a different spot. And then also we'll be talking about Ezra. And Ezra is coming back from the exile. And that's actually what ties these books together, because 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah are all written after the Israelites come back from this long exile. And then in our second year, our doctrine year, we're going to be talking about the 7th and 8th commandment. And so those two really relate well together. So this week and next week, we'll be talking about our last 4 commandments kind of in 2 blocks. And so we're going to hit the 7th and 8th commandment this week, talking about stealing and how we speak about and to one another. So let's dive in. Casey, give us a quick overview of 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
So 1st and 2nd Chronicles, like you mentioned, tells a lot of the same stories that you get in 1st and 2nd Kings, but there is a bit of a nuance to the way that Chronicles tells it. Chronicles contains a lot more genealogy, which is really a way to tell a long story in just a few words. So whenever you encounter a genealogy, this is kind of a way to speed the story along. And then
That's kind of ironic, because whenever you're reading a genealogy as a 21st century American, it's the moment your eyes go crossed and you feel like the story goes slower. So why is it this is something that speeds the story along?
Well, it speeds it up because in just one name, for people who've heard this story before, you can just hear the name of a certain person and remember, oh, yeah, that's what his story was all about.
It'd be kind of like us, sitting here in the middle of football season and talking about like Brett Favre, and we're like, oh,
Right,
okay.
yeah.
We totally remember that, even though he's not playing anymore. And so we list off like all the great quarterbacks, Joe Montana, Brett Favre, and just start like throwing them down. Dan Marino, poor guy, never got a Super Bowl, but we're not talking about that now. So that's kind of the idea behind a genealogy. That's good.
Yeah, and then you also see a few other nuances in Chronicles. You only get the stories of the kings in Jerusalem. You don't get the stories of the northern kings. And really this kind of highlights a different aspect of that time period, and maybe sheds it in a little bit more of a positive light.
Just, that was always really confusing for me too, because you had these 2 different kingdoms and you're always trying to kind of keep straight in your head which is which. The northern kingdom is the kingdom that's also known as Israel, and it is the wicked kingdom, always wicked, always straying away from God. The southern kingdom, known as Judah, is the kingdom that goes back and forth. So you usually have good kings in Judah, and you have bad kings in Judah, and so 1st Chronicles is going to just highlight the best of the best. It's kind of like Israel's way of coming back from the exile and remembering all the best parts of their history, the parts where they are totally and completely in line with God. And you don't even see as many of the mess-ups. So you're not going to see David's sin with Bathsheba in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because they don't want to highlight that, They want to highlight the good areas where they're following God. But this book, even though it's kind of like a greatest hits, it ends in a really weird way, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think highlighting some of the best pieces of Israel's history is actually designed to point the people toward a future messianic hope. And you see that this hope isn't quite fulfilled at the end of the book. You get this kind of interesting story where Cyrus, the king of Persia, gives this decree allowing the people to go back to Israel and rebuild the temple. And if you look at the last lines of the book, it says this. It says, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up." And then it ends. You don't actually find out what happened next. So you're kind of on the edge of a cliff wondering, all right, how is the story gonna play out?
Yeah, and I think that's really important because Ezra is also dealing with the same time period. He's not talking about the same subject Chronicles is, but it's written around the same time because Ezra, in coming back to the Promised Land, is trying to rebuild the temple. Ezra and Nehemiah are often connected. We'll talk about Nehemiah next week. But Ezra is the one that comes in, trying to rebuild the temple, rebuild the worship life of Jerusalem. See, their hope was when they returned from exile, Jerusalem and Israel, the nation as a whole, would be back on top, back in that spot. They thought that the promise God had of restoration was coming the first time they came back to the Promised Land. And the reality is there's a lot of disappointment in these books because the hope they thought was coming then didn't come then. And I think we can all relate to that. You know, we kind of like hope for something, and then all of a sudden you get to it, and there's that moment of, wait, that wasn't everything I thought it would be, kind of thing. That's how Israel's feeling as a nation. And the reality is, that's one of the strongest things that's pointing to Jesus. Because what God is showing us through this story is that the final hope isn't when they come back from exile. The final hope is coming in Jesus. And that's where you see all of these promises of God finally fulfilled.
So with that, let's dive into our second year material, the 7th and 8th commandments. We're talking about stealing and bearing false witness against your neighbor. You want to tackle the stealing first?
Yes. I will tackle that. Don't steal. Really, I think we're done there. No, it sounds kind of funny. It's one of those commandments you're like, hey, that's a great one to share with, our kids and stuff like that. But it really goes into the heart of continuing to honor your neighbor. And that's what you're going to see all of these commandments, this last half of commandments, really coming back to, which is, what's my relationship like with my neighbor? And it's not just about me and my stuff and what's best for me, but I have to realize that in this world, I am called to honor my neighbor and my neighbor's things. So this kind of goes right along with the idea of not coveting that you're going to see pop up later, which is I'm not supposed to look at, let's say, Casey's stuff and say, oh, well, I should have that stuff. Because if I should have that stuff, God would put that stuff in front of me. No, the reality is those are Casey's things, and I should honor those things as Casey's things and not go over and say, oh, well, I want that so bad, I'm just gonna steal it. I think that this also has deep implications for our work. This is an area where we can really stand out in culture. Because I think there's a lot of, the big ways that we don't steal, like literally breaking into someone's home and stealing something. There's also the little ways. When we go to work, are we honoring the time of the company that's paying us? Or are we finding ways to kind of cheat them out of some of the hours in which they're getting? Are we honoring our coworkers around us in how we treat them and the things that they have? So there's all kinds of little ways that these commandments can play out as well. In fact, I'm going to jump to Luther really quick on the 7th, and then we'll jump into the 8th. Luther says, we are to fear and love God so that we neither take our neighbor's money or property, nor acquire them by using shoddy merchandise or crooked deals, but instead help them improve and protect their property and income. And I think Luther did a great job saying we shouldn't even acquire things with shoddy deals. So like some of you are in positions where you make deals and you create contracts and agreements between organizations. And I think, what God is telling us is even in how we deal with our neighbor, we should not take advantage of them, even if we have the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, and I think another huge thing to remember in this commandment that talks a lot about like stuff or possessions, that ultimately none of us is the true owner of any of this. God is actually the one who's in control of this whole universe, and even the things that we believe are ours to a certain degree could be taken away from us at any moment, so to speak. So I think to keep stuff in its proper position is really key in this commandment.
Yeah, and that's why always in Scripture you'll never hear us called owners. You'll hear the word stewardship a lot, because you're a steward of something you don't ultimately own, even though everything around you tells you, wait, I own that, you know?
Yeah.
So Casey, tell us more about the 8th commandment.
So when we're talking about bearing false witness against your neighbor, what's really going on here is the question of how do we speak to one another? How do we speak about one another? And what kinds of things are happening as a result of the things that we say? If you think about a society in general, if you want a society to operate with good order, you need people who are going to speak the truth to one another. If everybody is going around telling falsehoods here, life in community just isn't going to work. So on kind of a base level, what this commandment is getting at here is like, let's all be honest so that we can actually work well with one another. But then I would say, like, on a deeper level, what's really key in this commandment is the reputation of somebody else. Mm-hmm. So like one of the most important things that another person has is his or her reputation, how others perceive them, what others think about them. And this commandment is asking us to hold that other person's reputation in high regard, so that we speak about them in such a way that others could see them in high regard also, and that when we speak to them, that we're also showing them the kind of respect they deserve as someone that God made.
Yeah, and this is also the commandment that's going to deal with gossip. So talking about people behind their back, that's kind of a pet peeve of mine, but I think it's really important to realize that how we talk about people is important. And here's kind of the tricky part about it. Before we dive into what Luther said, there are people that you always hold in high regard and you speak highly of because they're worthy of being spoken of highly. But, where this starts getting tricky is, how do you deal with those people that aren't that great? Because I think sometimes we're put in situations where we could dig into somebody's character and feel justified in doing so. But I think in realizing that, we need to stick with the truth, but we also need to be careful about how we are speaking about and of people, to be people of character that aren't taking every opportunity to dig somebody down just because they're not in the room, kind of thing. And so, when Luther's talking about this, Luther says, we are to fear and love God. And I love how he always starts with that. We're to fear and love God. It's Luther's way of saying, look, we live this out because of our love and fear, or you could even think in our terms, respect of God, so that we do not tell lies about our neighbors, betray or slander them, or destroy their reputations. Instead, we are to come to their defense, speak well of them, and interpret everything they do in the best possible light. And I think that's really important, especially in a social media culture, because there's this thing at play in a social media culture, and it's the illusion of anonymity. And what that basically means is this. It means you're sitting there by yourself, you're looking at your Facebook feed, and you want to comment and just dig into somebody, or you want to do a post that really kind of rips somebody down. And you think that you're alone, so you say the things you would normally say when you're alone, or you're in like a private conversation with like your spouse, but the reality is you're sitting there on a very public platform. And that's one of the difficulties, especially when you're talking to your kids about this commandment. Realize your kids are growing up in a world where things are far more public than they have ever been before. And when we put ourselves out there on public platforms like social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, a lot of these things, the digital life is a lot longer than what anybody actually realizes. And so to realize this commandment is probably more important today than it has ever been before in human history for us as a church and as individuals to learn to live out.
Yeah, and I think even reminding your kids that they're in a season of life where their own opinions have pretty strong bearing on the kind of identity formation and reputation formation that's going on among their peers. Your kids can play a powerful role in the lives of others by building up the reputation of their friends and their peers, and sometimes even through very small ways, like on social media. So I would encourage you all, as you seek to live this out, to encourage your kids to live this out, because it can make a huge difference in the lives of the people that they come into contact with on a daily basis.
So when you're doing that, especially when it comes to social media, and you may not even know what some of these terms are, talk about how your kids comment on other people's feeds, what it is they're doing. Talk to them about what they share and reshare, because just because they didn't develop the content doesn't mean They're not responsible for what they're resharing out to the world. So talk to them about those things, and then realize that in this culture, think back to when you were in middle school and high school and college, some of the stupid things you did that kind of got to disappear after you left college. Imagine if those were broadcasted out to the world and then followed you when you were stepping into your first career, into your marriage, into raising your own children, and realize that that's the reality your kids are living in. They've got a social media culture and a history that will follow them. And companies even look at their social media now. So if like your kids are applying for a job, your social media profiles are looked at. Like every time I've hired somebody to work as an intern or on our staff, like I've looked at their social media, and I dug deep because I wanted to know, who this person is that we're bringing on staff. And so realize that's kind of a reality. So this commandment, I mean, you can't overemphasize the importance of it with your kids, but this also gives you handles to talk really practically about things that are in Scripture and apply so deeply today.
Oh yeah, I think that connection is awesome.
So, hey guys, for this week, thank you so much for hanging out with us right here on Confirmation 2.0. If you have more questions or you want to reach out to us, go to bethlehemchurch.live on the mobile app or on our website. We've got contact forms out there. We're always here for you to help you dig deeper into faith and dig deeper into discipling your own kids. But for right now, it's been a joy to hang out with you right here on Confirmation 2.0, and we look forward to seeing you next week right here on Confirmation 2.0.